everyone, thanks for tuning in. In the lead up to World Poetry Day on Thursday, the 21st of March, we are interviewing some of our wonderful poets who stuck with us at the Book Dragon. Today, we have the pleasure of being joined by Rachel Jones. Hi, Rachel.
Hello.
And Rachel has very kindly agreed to answer some questions for us. So, I'd like to start by asking you, Rachel, when did you first discover your gift for writing poetry?
Um, I used to write poetry just because I liked writing poetry, and I don't remember really sharing it with anybody until I was in my 20s because it was very much a personal thing. Then when I was in my 20s, I was part of a creative writing group, and they did an anthology, and I got a couple of poems in an anthology, and then I thought I was the big news, and people actually were enjoying the poetry that I wrote. I used to write like I played in a band, so I used to write lyrics, song lyrics. So that was an acceptable way of writing poetry. And then I used to write humorous stuff, but I never wrote sort of serious stuff for adults until I was in well, till I'd become a mum and joined this creative writing group. And then I found that gave me the confidence to go on and keep crafting and keep working at it. You know, and it was then that I suddenly sort of realised that I could do it. And it didn't have to be funny, and it didn't have to rhyme. It could just be pure emotion put on to a blank page.
Hmm. And which poets inspired you?
Oh my goodness. Well, I was really lucky that my parents were teachers. So I was brought up, and the first things that I heard that were read to me was poetry. So I had Edward Lear read to me. I had T.S. Eliot, the cat, read to me. Um, Also, a lot of Spike Milligan because my dad was a bit of a Goon fan. So I had
Mhm.
nonsense poetry read to me. I had all kinds, and I just loved it. It was apparently I liked the poetry more than I liked the storybooks, and I think it's because it was the rhythm, because those poems were written with a rhythm. So and the things like Hilaire Belloc, who wrote about naughty children, in poems about naughty children, and apparently I really liked those, these little sort of themes of naughty kids. So I really, really enjoyed that poetry. And then we were like, we were lucky that we used to go, lucky, I mean, we used to go to Wales every summer to get rained on in a tent. And on the way there, my dad used to put on a cassette tape that my mum had recorded from the record player, and it was things like Max Boyce. Now, Max Boyce, for anybody that probably doesn't know who he is a Welsh, used to be a miner, but he then started doing around the working men's clubs. He did humorous poetry and songs, and some of his stuff obviously kind of went right over my head because I was a kid and I didn't get all the kind of the jokes. But today I actually went and looked up some of his poems ahead of this interview, and some of them were really, really good. And so I'm fortunate to have like the Welsh lilt, and there's not a language or an accent like Welsh for poetry. It's just musical, really musical. So I had Max Boyce, and I remember that. And I looked up the album, and it was from 1974, so that would have made me about 8 or 9. And I remember very clearly enjoying these poems in the car because they were fun. And of course, my mum and dad were laughing, and it was great. And then I was bought Pam Ayres Planet Earth's album, and I looked at the year of that, and that was when I was about 11. So I actually, looking back today, I realised that they knew a bit more about my taste than I did. So I had a Pam Ayres album, um, and I've had fun looking at her stuff again today as well. And so that was my poetry background, this kind of humorous, cozy, warm, lovely stuff. It wasn't very challenging. It was very safe poetry. And then I went off to grammar school, and I was at 12, and we started doing the poets of the First World War.
Mm.
And I was never the same again because I'd moved out of my kind of my little safe kindergarten poetry into this hellish landscape. And the poem that changed my life was Dulce Decorum by Wilfred Owen, and I've never read anything like it since. It and as a 12-year-old, it blew me away, and reading it even now as an adult, 30 years later, it's still so emotive, and the imagery is so powerful. And then you go on and you find out the story of the poet, and the fact that he died in the First World War, and all this sort of stuff. And then you learn about all the other First World War poets. And I was really into how the poetry changed from the beginning of the war, when it was all hooray, let's all go off the war, yippee, to they went through and it was awful, and then the kind of poems at the end of the war, which were like, what have we done? We can't ever do this again, And so yeah, it was Wilfred Owen's poem, that Dulce et Decorum, that changed my my whole world view of poetry, and what it could do and what it could say, because he wrote stuff that rhymes, but he also wrote stuff that just cut through completely his imagery, his use of words, and his use of comparatives, and you could smell his poetry. You could, he talks about bells tolling and gas and people gasping. And so you're there with it. I'd never quite experienced that before. I'd experienced happiness and joining in, but never that kind of being totally immersed in someone's poem. So that was what changed me, really changed me. And I still love to read First World War poetry now. And I'm interested now because they've released a bit more of the stuff that was anti-war, that was written, that was kind of wasn't really published because propaganda and all the rest of it. And I just find it absolutely fascinating, really fascinating. So yeah, First World War poetry, and I don't think I'm alone in that experience. In being through the British school system, I think I've talked to a lot of people, and they say, I remember that. I remember doing that. I don't remember a lot of what I did at school, but yeah, I remember that poetry. I remember that stuff. It really,
Same. I
it
remember
physically
it.
affects an age. Yeah.
Yeah. Very
And
powerfully
it's
from
like,
my own school.
wow.
I remember doing the First World War poetry. Yeah.
And it's because it's just, wow. It just blows your mind. It really does. It changes you. It makes you kind of blows you up a little bit, I think. Yeah.
Mhm.
So that's my favourite poem, which is a
Yeah.
bit sad, really. It's quite an awful poem,
It's
but it's
sad, but
unity in it.
I can definitely understand why you chose it because it is amazing and very powerful. And what
Mm.
is your favorite poem that you've written yourself, Rachel? And could you recite a few lines for us?
Well, I've written a load, and sometimes I write poems because I don't understand what's happening. I wrote a poem last week because I was at a conference and I was having this massive mental block trying to understand it. So I wrote a poem about cognitive dissonance.
Hmm.
And it's really hard to find a word that rhymes with dichotomy, but I did. But anyway,
Well done.
it wasn't one of my better poems. But I use poetry as a key for myself sometimes. I put all the ideas together, make a poem out of it, and then I can look at it and go, that's what I'm trying to think. It's not necessarily what I'm trying to say, but it's what I'm trying to think. Um, but the one I wrote fairly recently, it's quite short. I mean, it's not like a 50-line thing, and I'm very happy to read it.
Mhm.
And it was one of the ones that I wrote when I was just being bombarded. It was when I was just being bombarded with, I'm a nurse, I work in healthcare, and it was just in a really difficult time when we were losing people, and it was just hard. And and people would say things like, oh, thoughts and prayers and all this stuff, and it made me really angry because it's doctors and nurses, not thoughts and prayers, and so that was my poem. So I think it's got about 12 lines. Would you like me to read
Yeah, that would be amazing. Thank you, Rachel.
it? Okay, it's called Absent All Others. Okay. Well, you promised, then you vowed, so I breathed your words aloud. Then you painted on the sky, put a rainbow through my eyes. Now the angels would adore me. You laid a table out before me, hung the moon to light the night, sent my enemies to flight. Said you'd catch me should I fall, which was the biggest lie of all. You were the anchor letting go, not one arrow, just a bow. So of course I came to harm without a still, small voice of calm. And even though I held your name, you were the god that never came.
Thank you so much for sharing that with us. And is that going to be in any future collections?
Yeah, it's going to have to be somewhere. I've got to pad the books out with something.
Oh, that's something to look forward to. And what advice would you give to anyone wanting to start writing poetry?
Right, get a pen with a piece of paper, and it doesn't matter if it's the back of an envelope or write it on your phone, whatever. Just if you, I like to say that poems get born. Um, so you may have in your head a phrase that goes around for a bit in a rhythm. If you think poetically, you sometimes get a. I suppose it's much like how songwriters work. They get a melody. So it's the same with poetry. You may get that rhythm, those words, or that kind of how you want it to go. Write it down. You can write it down 1,000 times and change it 1,000 times. My poetry rough draft are just squiggles and lines and doodles and stuff. And and it'll take me 5 or 6 times sort of pages to perfect it. But just keep writing it. Just keep writing it. And even if it's rubbish, don't worry. Just put it in your portfolio and write something else. Because I can still remember the first poem I ever wrote, which I wrote when my rabbit died, which is, it's a 7-year-old poem, but it was it was such a big emotion for me that I wrote it down and I was able to express it. And poetry, I think, is just raw. It's pure raw emotions. It's to be able to craft a good poem is sometimes a more honest way of telling your story. Because you play with the words until you can mold them into the message that you're trying to use. So don't ever be discouraged about poetry. And you know what? No one has to like it. It doesn't matter. No one has to like what you write. No one has to do what you like. As long as when you write it, you go, oh, I think I've got that out. It's like coughing up a hairball.
So it sounds as
just
much as therapy as creativity.
I think in a way it is because
Yeah.
you're not having to think of it's different from writing prose because you're not having to think of beginning, middle, and ends and plots and all this sort of character arcs and stuff. You're using sometimes you use words as weapons, sometimes you use them as meditation, sometimes you use them to soothe yourself, or you find a rhythm that you write that's soothing, or you find a rhythm that you write that uplifts you. It could be all things and anything, and it's just get it out of you. Everybody has a poem in them, definitely, but it doesn't have to be liked. It doesn't have to go on the side of a bus for people to applaud. You can just write it. That's okay. And when you're sitting, in your rocking chair when you're 90, you can pull out the poem you wrote about Taylor Swift and go, this is what happened in my day when Taylor Swift was all the rage or whatever. Just write the bloody thing. Don't be afraid.
Well, that's some brilliant advice there. And you can buy Rachel's 2 collections of poetry and short stories, Dregs and Dregs 2, at our bookshop at 6 West Row, Stockton-on-Tees, or from our website, thebookdragon.co.uk. Thanks again for joining us, Rachel.
You're very welcome.
And thank you all for watching. And remember to look out for more World Poetry Day interviews in the lead up to March the 21st.